Shalom Alechem, Erev Tov, good evening. Tonight is Lag BaOmer. And in honor of tonight, I would like to dedicate the Shiur in honor of my father. He should live and be well, and good health and happiness, B'ezrat Hashem. Tonight I wanted to take you somewhere different than I've taken you before. At least in this Shiur. For those of you who've been learning with me for a while, and this name is going to be very familiar for you. But for those of you who this might be your first time, at least in our Beit HaMikdash, this name is going to be new. It'll be a new discovery, a new personality. So for now we've been reading the writings of Rabbi Haim David Halevy. Rabbi Haim David Halevy was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv Yafo, among other jobs that he held. For those who want to know more about Rabbi Haim David Halevy, there's a book that I recommend, and I'm sorry that some of the books I'm going to recommend tonight may be out of print. So they might not actually be readily available, and if they're not, you can always try to reach out to the author. I've heard that he has some extra copies on hand. And Rabbi Mark Angel, along with Rabbi Chaim Angel, wrote a book called Rabbi Haim David Halevy. It's titled Gentle Scholar and Courageous Thinker. I recommend this book very much. If there's one book of Rabbi Angel that I recommend more than this book, though, that's this book here. I have to tell you, this book is out of print, so it's certainly out of print. I think I checked on Amazon today, and there's one copy for $250. My brother Onen reached out, thanks to his mother-in-law, Dr. Bella Haas-Weinberg. She reached out to Rabbi Angel himself. He said he has a few copies in New York at the Institute of Jewish Ideas and Ideals. I think that's what it's called. And if you want to get a copy, you can get one there. But this book here, it's titled Loving Truth and Peace, the Grand Religious Worldview of Rabbi Benzion Uziel. It's also by Rabbi Angel. This book is gold. Nothing bad about the other book, but this book is gold. I can recommend the book. I rarely recommend books, especially books in English. But this book is something that's very special. It's very unique. It will give you a lot of insight into the life, the teachings, the vision for Judaism and Torah that HaRav Benzion Meir Uziel had. In fact, this book is so rare. I never lend it out. And the one time that I lent it to somebody, this you have to know, it's a true story. Mamash, true story. I would show you the letter inside of the book, but I don't want to out the person who did this. So I never lend this book out. But I lent it to one person who begged me to borrow the book. They borrowed the book, and of course, they never gave it back to me. So when I was once in Stematsky bookstore in Israel, the bookmark said, don't lend out books because people never give books back. And then the other side of the bookmark said, in fact, my entire library is made up of books that I never gave back to other people. Unfortunately, there are some people that this is their whole personality. They take, they don't give. Fast forward a few years later, it was my birthday, which is this week, and somebody, the same person that took the book, gave it back to me as a birthday present, with recommendations handwritten all over the book of which chapters I should read. And so I'm very grateful to have the book. I'm not complaining. Whoever gave it back, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bless them double for giving it back. But this book is a very special book, and it's gold because I almost lost it. So more than that, I can't recommend the book enough. HaRav Uziel was, this is a book in Hebrew about HaRav Uziel. There's a nice picture on the front. I don't know if you can see that very well. But HaRav Uziel was the counterpart of a famous Ashkenazi rabbi, HaRav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, alav Shalom. They were chief rabbis of Israel together. One of the primary differences between the rabbinate of HaRav Uziel and HaRav Kook, both of them shared very idealistic visions for a modern state of Israel and the land of Israel. The difference was that HaRav Uziel was able to be the chief rabbi of the state of Israel from 1948 until 1953. HaRav Kook passed away many, many years earlier. I believe HaRav Kook passed away in 1939, perhaps. That was the year that he passed away. Almost 10 years before the founding of the State of Israel. I don't know why. I have theories on why the writings of HaRav Kook have become so famous and so publicized, and everyone knows them, or many people have access to them if they would want to know them. Let's say it that way, it's better. But the writings of HaRav Uziel are, I would say they're coming to light, but that's very optimistic of me to tell you that they're coming to light. Are there people that study the writings of Uziel? Absolutely. Many more than some of the other rabbis that I might mention throughout these shiurim. But enough? Not enough. And if I could tell you, in my opinion, and I'm no one to compare rabbis with each other, but in my opinion, the ideals for the Jewish future that Rav Uziel proposed are much more grounded, are much more palatable to the Jewish community that we are in, the life that we are expecting from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and His people, than perhaps some of the more messianic or otherwise very idealistic ideals of HaRav Kook. And I think that a lot could be gained by the Jewish community, even to study these two Chachamim side by side, but at the very least to spend some more time studying the writings of HaRav Uziel. Why is HaRav Uziel important for us today in the Shiur? Because the rabbi who we've been studying and we're going to be studying much about in his commentary in the Rambam, Rabbi Haim David Halevy, is a student and also a secretary of HaRav Uziel. So he is a main disciple of HaRav Uziel. Rabbi Haim David Halevy spent much of his life learning Torah from HaRav Uziel. I don't have the exact years to tell you. And in addition to studying from HaRav Uziel, Rabbi Haim David Halevy also studied from HaRav Kook, which, in my opinion, gives him the best of both worlds. He was able to bring together Sephardic and Ashkenazi thought and opinions and visions for the Jewish future in ways that other Chachamim may have been a little more one-sided on. And so today I wish to take a step back into the generation of HaRav Uziel and to read a much shorter introduction to his book on Jewish national law than that of Rabbi Haim David Halevy that we spent a few weeks on. With your permission, I ask that you open up that PDF titled HaShofet VeHaMishpat and the article titled HaMishpat VeHaShofet inside of that very same book. In Hebrew, the books look like this. All the writings of Rav Uziel were reprinted by the Vad Lahotzat Kitvei HaRav Uziel, the organization to disseminate the writings of Rav Uziel. Dr. Ezra Barnea, who's a special Talmid Chacham, I sat with him a number of years ago in Yerushalayim, and I pretty much bought one of every book of Rav Uziel that was still in print. Already then, he was very old and very difficult for him to continue printing the writings of Rav Uziel. I bought everything he had in stock because he told me nothing else was going to be reprinted, at least not in his lifetime. And I heard rumors that there's someone else that I'm close to that may have purchased the rights to reprint Rav Uziel's book, but for now, they're not in stock so much. So whatever you find from Rav Uziel, snatch it up, and whatever you can learn, even better. If you look together with me on the first page of this book, Sefer HaShofet VeHaMishpat, מאשר השאיר אחריו ברכה הראשון לציון הרב הראשי לישראל, that which was left behind is a blessing to us by the chief rabbi, the Rishon LeZion, HaRav Benzion Meir Chai Uziel, Zecher Tzedek Lebracha, Rabbi Benzion Meir Chai Uziel. Sometimes the Sfaradim will call him HaRav Tzemach Uziel. Tzemach, Tzion, Meir Chai, Rashi Tevot is an acronym for Tzemach. The Rishon LeZion and the Rav Harashi Yisrael. Can anyone tell me anything about the difference between the title of Rishon LeZion and the title of Chief Rabbi of Israel? Anything. There's no right answer I'm looking for. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nהיה b'oro. There's a button on your screen that says unmute. You're welcome to use it.
The Rishon LeZion is the Sephardic rabbi and the Rav Harashi is Ashkenazi.
Okay, so but here he's using both titles. And there was definitely an Ashkenazi chief rabbi when he was chief rabbi. Okay, but maybe Rachel, I'm going to push you because Rachel's been around the Shiurim for a long time. In terms of how long these two chief rabbis have been around, do you know which one has been around longer?
The Rishon LeZion.
The Rishon LeZion. So let me maybe walk you through very quickly. A few governments ago, and in Israel, I don't know anymore how to count which government was which, because like every other weekend there's a new government in Israel. But a few governments ago in Israel, there was a bid to dissolve the office of chief rabbis. There should be only one. There is no Sephardic prime minister and Ashkenazi prime minister. There is no Sephardic mayor and Ashkenazi mayor. There shouldn't be a Sephardic and Ashkenazi chief rabbi. But when I asked HaRav Peretz about this, what he thinks, he said, if they could dissolve both, it would be great. But if they're going to dissolve one, I'll be a fan of whichever one they dissolve first. So here, the chief rabbinate, though, should we dissolve it into two? Does it make sense? There should be one chief rabbi. And I think that you have to read a little bit about the history of HaRav Kook and HaRav Uziel to even begin to understand what is the question that we're dealing with now. In an ideal world, sure, it would be great to have one chief rabbi that all the Jewish people could look up to and respect and learn from. I'm not taking away from that ideal, but historically, in Israel, there was a Chacham Bashi, a chief rabbi, Rishon LeZion. The office of chief rabbi, I have a set of books here, doesn't matter. I have a set of books here written by Rabbi Moshe Gaon, Moshe David Gaon. Have you heard Rabbi Moshe David Gaon? Those of you in my Bet HaKnesset don't answer this question.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
He's the father of Yoram Gaon. You know Yoram Gaon, who he is?
a singer.
He's a singer, he's a movie producer, he's all kinds of things in Israel. His father was the secretary of the chief rabbinate of Israel in the early years of the chief rabbinate. We likely will get into some writings of Gaon in this class. He is a very, very important thinker, but more than a thinker, a historian of Sephardic Jewish history as it pertains to the land of Israel. He wrote 2 volumes, Yehudei HaMizrach ve'Eretz Yisrael, the Jews of the East in the land of Israel. And you should know, even though he didn't identify as a Jew of the East, but he used the word Mizrach because clearly that's the word that was given to Sephardim, the name that was given to Sephardim in Israel. And he records the history of Sephardim in Eretz Yisrael. But for those writing in the chat, I can't actually read the chat while I'm teaching, so if you want to ask the question, it's important for now, you can unmute yourself. If you want to wait till the end, you can ask in the end too, but I can't. The screen is actually very far away from me to be able to read what's being written in the chat box. HaRav Gaon records there all the Sephardic chief rabbis of Israel, going back some 380 years, maybe a little more than that, maybe 400 years even. But there's been a Rishon LeZion in Eretz Yisrael for hundreds of years. When HaRav Kook came to Eretz Yisrael, who sent HaRav Kook to Eretz Yisrael? It's important to know history. Who sent HaRav Kook to Eretz Yisrael?
Chafetz Chaim.
The Chafetz Chaim. So his rabbi, who he studied with in Kollel, the Chafetz Chaim had a Kollel. Anyone know what was special about the Kollel of the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Israel, Meir HaKohen of Radin?
Kohanim.
Very good. It was a Kollel of Kohanim. It was a Kollel for Kohanim.
Prepare them for Avodat Bet HaMikdash.
Very good. The Chafetz Chaim was of the opinion that Bet HaMikdash was going to be rebuilt any day now. It's very important for people to, especially the Kohanim, to know how to serve in the Bet HaMikdash when the Bet HaMikdash will be rebuilt. By the way, I highly recommend. I know sometimes I mention names like Chafetz Chaim. There's some kind of, it might even be a negative stigma in the Jewish street. Oh, the Chafetz Chaim. Let me tell you that it's very important to read about Jewish personalities beyond the way that, I'm not going to mention any publishing houses by name, but beyond the way that normative Orthodox publishing houses will present them. Okay, there's usually more to their life and to their story and to what they were bringing to the table than what fits the agenda of contemporary Orthodoxy or other movements inside of Judaism today. There's a professor, Mark Shapiro, a special Talmid Chacham. He wrote a number of books. I don't agree with everything Professor Mark Shapiro says in all of his books, but in one of his writings, it's called Changing the Immutable. I think the subtitle is How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History, something like that. And in there, in the introduction to the book, Professor Shapiro, he quotes a very important saying from a socialist historian. He says, the most difficult part of being a socialist historian is knowing how to predict the past. You have to create a history that fits with the agenda that you're making up right now as you go along. Unfortunately, the American Orthodox Jewish community, and the Israeli Orthodox Jewish community is in the same category, have a very hard time rewriting their history in order to make it work with the Judaism that they are peddling in the street today. And so sometimes the Chafetz Chaim of this publishing house and the Chafetz Chaim that I am studying or you might be studying may be two completely different people. As a case study, if you want to study something, and I'm taking a tangent, but I told my wife before I came here, my wife and I were talking about Shiurim and what we should prepare and what should be the next step of this class. We're already 6 classes in together. And so now this is a Bet HaMikdash. Now we're friends. And so as friends, I'm not going to put up any image for you. Part of being a Bet HaMikdash is that this is not just a shiur. A shiur means I promise to deliver A, B, C in a class, and I deliver A, B, C in a class. Bet Midrash is we learn together. Wherever the learning takes us, that's where we're going to end up. And if it takes us 100 years to get to where we need to get, that's what take us 100 years. We have, B'ezrat Hashem, 120 years together anyways. So if you bring up something and that's an important tangent we should take, we'll take it. And nobody should feel anxious about making it to the end, because there is no end. This is about learning together. And so the tangent, here's a good tangent. There's a very famous woman. Her name was Sarah Schneer. Have you heard of Sarah Schneer?
Yaakov. She started the Bet Yaakov.
Okay.
I went to that school.
So she started the Bet Yaakov movement, and my mother's correct. My mother went to a Sarah Schneer Bet Yaakov in Bnei Brak. Sarah Schneer is a very interesting personality, because I can tell you that I only have more respect for her, after reading her real life story than what I previously thought about her in the edited and adulterated version of her life. So she's pretty impressive as the storybooks go, but she's even more impressive when you read about her real life. There's a doctor, I think her name is Naomi Seidman. I think that's her name. She wrote a book. The name of the book is slipping my mind right now. It might be called The Beis Yaakov Movement, something quite generic. But she dedicated her research as a PhD, and perhaps beyond that, to research the real Sarah Schneer, beyond the Jewish publishing houses and what they told you about her. And to recognize a woman of that caliber who stood up. They talk about the rabbinic backing of Beis Yaakov. Today, Beis Yaakov is like super normative, mainstream in many places. Then the rabbinic backing for Beis Yaakov was non-existent. More than non-existent, it was actually antagonistic towards such a movement. And what she was trying to accomplish was far beyond just giving young Jewish girls an education in, challah baking or kugel making or whatever else happens in the schools today. She was intent on solving problems that the rabbis of Eastern Europe were not even aware, or if they were aware, they were turning a blind eye or burying their head in the sand, that were happening in their own communities, in their own towns. And she single-handedly, she single-handedly saved generations of Jewish women. And it would be wise for us to know the real Sarah Schneer and the real story of her. She doesn't have to be, I'm not into heroes, but a person who really championed a vision for the future, at least of Eastern European Jewish women. I can't recommend that book highly enough either. Maybe if my wife remembers the title, I took it from her library. So, Rabbanit, if you remember the title, if you could post it in the chat box, I'd appreciate it very much. How did I get to Sarah Schneer? By telling you about the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim had a Kollel for young Kohanim that he was hoping to teach how to be Kohanim if the Beit HaMikdash was actually rebuilt. And he believed that was something imminent that was happening. And the Chafetz Chaim, one of his students, was a young Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. HaRav Kook studied previously in a yeshiva known as... I'm hoping people here at least know enough about Rav Kook.
Was it Bialystok?
So he was a rabbi in Bialystok.
But did they go to Slobodka?
Close, not Slobodka. I mean, I don't know where they're on the map, but another famous yeshiva in Eastern Europe.
Berlin?
I guess either Volozhin or Novardo.
Very good, Volozhin. He went to Yeshivat Volozhin. And there's an article written by one of the rabbis in Israel called 10 Stories Every Yeshiva Student Should Know About Rabbi Kook. And it's very, today we think of Rav Kook as some controversial rabbinic figure that the ultra-Orthodox establishment was out to get and hated him. He studied by the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. But how highly did the Netziv think of HaRav Kook? When HaRav Kook came back to Europe from Israel to visit, I don't know if he was there fundraising, he was there traveling, I don't know what he was there for. He came during the 9 days to the home of the Netziv. And the Netziv told his wife to make meat and to serve wine at the meal, because a meal that a Rav Kook is sitting at is considered a Sudat Mitzvah, and you should eat meat and drink wine at such a meal. That's in how high regard he was. He wasn't, the narrative today that Rav Kook was some fringe Ashkenazi rabbi in Israel that everybody hated. Listen, I'm not telling you again that I agree with all the ideology of Rav Kook, but in the Ashkenazi community of then, he was considered a very normative figure. HaRav Kook studied by the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim told him, listen, it's time you should go to Israel and start paving the way for a Jewish community to be living in Israel, a chief rabbinate and the like. HaRav Kook comes to Israel. And in Israel, he meets a very special breed of Jews. Jews that are building the land of Israel, some of them that are the most antagonistic towards religion and Torah that he may have ever met, even in Europe. He also meets a group of Jews that are antagonistic towards him because he's a believer in the Zionist ideal of building a Jewish state. Some of the rabbis he has to contend with in his time there were pushed forward by the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. There's a book of the Satmar Rebbe, letters, and in there he calls HaRav Kook Ish Tsar ve'oyev hara hazeh. Evil man, this wicked person, has the same word that we use about Haman in Megillat Esther. This is what Rav Kook had to contend with in Israel. And Rav Kook decided, let's start a chief rabbinate. And the Ashkenazi community in Israel was split. Do we make a chief rabbinate? Do we not? Is Rav Kook the right candidate? Is he not? So who adopted HaRav Kook into the chief rabbinate was the existing Rishon LeZion. The existing Sephardic chief rabbinate of Israel agreed to adopt HaRav Kook inside by the leadership of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is the rabbi of HaRav Uziel. We have no writings from Rabbi Meir because every one of his handwritten manuscripts, he wrote volumes of commentary on Shulchan Aruch. Every one of his manuscripts were burned in a house fire. And ever since then, Yaakov Meir said every time that he got his pen to write, he just couldn't write. He was crying so much that he wasn't able to see the page anymore. It's just so hard to build something you've already built. To see it destroyed and try to rebuild it. It's with anything in the world. Like the Jews in Egypt. They build things and Pitom and Ram says they come to the ground. You know how hard it is to work again tomorrow, do the same thing? Someone's in a relationship, the relationship is struggling every single day to try over again. It's harder than trying to start new relationships every day together. Rabbi Yaakov Meir incorporated HaRav Kook into his chief rabbinate. HaRav Uziel continued that. Even when HaRav Kook passed away, the next chief rabbis were considered part of the Sephardic and Ashkenazi now chief rabbinate of Israel. And when I hear today people wanting to get rid of the chief rabbinate, or at least one side of the chief rabbinate, I sometimes wonder if they're aware of the history of how many hundreds of years one chief rabbi has been in office and how few years the other one has been. You know, not all Sephardic rabbis viewed the merging of Sephardic and Ashkenazi rabbis together as a good move. Famously, there was one Sephardic chief rabbi who really criticized HaRav Uziel for merging together with HaRav Kook. Do you know who I'm talking about? His name was HaRav Ovadia Yosef, alav shalom. HaRav Ovadia Yosef considered HaRav Uziel to be nothing short of a sellout to HaRav Kook. He viewed HaRav Uziel's respect to HaRav Kook as lacking a backbone of holding up Sephardic values in the face of antagonist Ashkenazi rabbi like HaRav Kook. And unfortunately, that's not the correct way to read history, with all due respect to HaRav Ovadia Yosef. If one understands the philosophy of HaRav Uziel, you will recognize that more important to him than Sephardic or Ashkenazi was the unity of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. That ultimately the Jewish people should be one Jewish people. There should not be a Sephardic and Ashkenazi nation going in. We're not two nations, we're one nation. And if we as chief rabbis can get together and agree on certain standards and norms together, and our respective communities will follow them, then how great would it be if Sephardim gave up certain things and Ashkenazim gave up other things? But as long as we can do this life going forward together, then I don't care about what we did yesterday if I can ensure the future of tomorrow. I don't view that as being a pushover at all. I view that as probably being some of the most sound thinking that we have had in Jewish history in recent years. But hey, who am I? On the next page. This all ties in together to who's on the next page. Now, usually I don't copy the copyright page of the books that I'm probably infringing copyright by copying their books, right? Usually I don't do that, but here I had to read to you some names. You'll notice on this list, Chavrei Havad, these are the members of the committee to publish the writings of HaRav Uziel. Look 4 lines down. Professor Ezra Barnea is the one that I mentioned to you that I sat with in Yerushalayim. Hashem should bless him with good health and a long life. The next person is Professor Tzvi Zohar, a very dear friend of mine and of the Shiviti Bet HaMidrash. For those of you in Kilat Shar Shamayim, he's been here before, he learned Torah with us here. Any book that you can find written by Professor Tzvi Zohar is a book you should read. And let's go back up to the top. HaRishon LeZion, HaRav Mordechai Eliyahu, he's no longer alive. The chief Sephardic rabbi, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. You know, when I think about chief rabbis and their smiles and the beautiful personalities that chief rabbis used to have. I can't tell you that I recognize that in all chief rabbis. But certain Talmidei Chachamim, my Simcha certificate was supposed to be signed by Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. Any certificate that HaRav Peretz signed on, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu would sign on also. But when I came to Israel, he already got sick, and so by the time they reissued our Smicha certificates, he had already passed away. They removed his place for his signature from our Te'udot. Chacham Mordechai Eliyahu was a beautiful chief rabbi, a very special person. There's a book that I have in my home. It's a very simple commentary. Chacham Mordechai Eliyahu wrote a Sephardic commentary on the Ashkenazi Kitzur Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried. And in the beginning he explains that initially he was just writing an abridged version of the Ben Ish Chai. He wanted some Sephardic halachot that Israeli school children can have in school that also represented their Sephardic tradition. So then he was about to publish that book, and then he remembered the story of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you can see in my book, Shalom, or in my classes that I taught about Maran, that the Ramah, who wrote an Ashkenazi book of halakha, like a Shulchan Aruch, he buried his book and instead chose to write comments on the Sephardic Shulchan Aruch so the Jewish people would study from one book. Chacham Mordechai Eliyahu did the same thing. He got rid of his book, the abridged Ben Ish Chai, and he wrote instead a commentary of his Sephardic opinions on the Ashkenazi Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and this book is found in many bookstores. You can find it if you wanted to study Kitzur Shulchan Aruch with Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu's commentary. You could get that, and today you're able to find Sephardic and Ashkenazi perspectives on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in many Jewish schools, at least in Eretz Yisrael. This is a man who really understood the vision of HaRav Uziel. The next is Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg. He's also no longer alive. I spoke to you about Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg in the first class that we had as one of the few rabbis who wrote a book on Jewish national law. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, he's the Tzitz Eliezer is the name of his book, but I showed you a blue book called Hilchot Medina, the laws of the state of Israel, that his descendants didn't want printed, and I told you a story that I got that book in a very short window of time where those books were being sold. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, I mentioned him in an article that I wrote for the Chavura in the United Kingdom. It's going to be posted in the Google Classroom as soon as class is over. It will be one of the automatic suggested readings that pop up in the Google Classroom. It's called the failed experiment of Mizug Galuyot, the failed attempt to unite Sephardim and Ashkenazim in the land of Israel. One of the leaders of that movement was HaRav Uziel. HaRav Uziel started the World Sephardic Yeshiva. HaRav Kook started the World Yeshiva. That's what Merkaz HaRav Kook of them is the central yeshiva of the world. Essentially, that's what Rav Kook thought he was building. HaRav Uziel started the World Sephardic Yeshiva. I guess that was interesting why those two yeshivot, but he started the yeshiva. And when he was looking to start the yeshiva, who did he appoint as the Rosh Yeshiva of the World Sephardic Yeshiva? And he writes in the mission statement of the yeshiva to create Sephardic thinkers, Sephardic poskim, Sephardic philosophers, Sephardic poets, Sephardic musicians. Who did he appoint as the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat HaSefaradim? Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg. And you have to ask yourself a question: what on earth does Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, you may not know anything about him, but you can know enough about him from his last name to recognize that he's not so Sephardic, at least not ethnically. Why is he the Rosh Yeshiva? When they asked HaRav Uziel that question, he said, Ki hu ra'ui lekach. He's the one who's fitting to be a Sephardic Rosh Yeshiva. And then he went on to give a speech. He said, it was not Spain that gave us poskim and poets and chachamim. It was not Ashkenaz that gave us all of the chachamim and the authors of volumes of commentary in the Talmud. It was despite those two exiles that we had chachamim, not because of them. He said, and therefore Rav Waldenberg is the person who he embodies both of those traditions perfectly, flawlessly was able to weave together Sephardic and Ashkenazi thought. And Rav Uziel appointed him as the Rosh Yeshiva. I don't know if you've ever read the writings of Rav Waldenberg, but I recommend. It's a unique perspective. He was the rabbi of the Shiur Tzedek Hospital in Yerushalayim. Rav Waldenberg, when you're reading his writings, you can't help but be in awe of how much Torah of Chachmei Sfarad he knew. The books that he's quoting, Shelot v'Tshuvot, commentaries on Shulchan Aruch, even Sephardic rabbis that were alive in his generation. HaRav Yosef, young Sephardic rabbis that he was quoting from their books, and he weaves them together into some beautiful picture of what is the Tzitz Eliezer. I have to tell you, there are other rabbis that lived in his generation that you read their books and there is nothing Sephardic in those books. You're painfully aware that if the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch were not printed in Vilna, this rabbi would not know them. HaRav Waldenberg was a unique Chacham that was able to fuse traditions together. And we owe him almost everything that we have from HaRav Uziel. Because when HaRav Uziel passed away, his descendants were not exactly members of the Beit HaMikdash. I'm saying it very lightly out of respect to him. And it was Rav Waldenberg who for many, 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 many years kept all of the manuscripts of Rav Uziel together until he was able to hand them off to this Vad to publish them. If I could just tell you how hard it is, we're still getting books of Rav Uziel. There's a commentary in my bookcase, a very short book, of notes of Rav Uziel on the Talmud. Random notes on the Talmud. Different masechtot on the Talmud. And when I spoke to somebody who was involved in this committee, how did you get those notes? He said right after HaRav Uziel passed away, his Shas, this whole set of Talmud, disappeared from the Shiva house. Someone stole it. Along with many other books of Rav Uziel. Now half of the books that he wrote, but sometimes there's things that he wrote inside of other books that someone could publish later. They were missing. It wasn't until a very famous rabbi, whose name I will not mention on camera, a very, very famous rabbi passed away, and one of the members of this committee went to the Shiva house of that rabbi, that he found the Shas of HaRav Uziel in this rabbi's library. And the children of that rabbi sold every volume back. So I guess we all have something in common today with book stealing. They sold every volume back to this committee at top dollar. And they reprinted those notes on the Shas of HaRav Uziel. Tov, I just gave you a whole lesson on HaRav Uziel. Technically, we could just call it a day and end it over here. Let's get started on his introduction. You're okay with that? Perfect. Any questions or comments before we jump into the book head first?
Yes, I have a question on
Please.
something you mentioned earlier. Okay, because you mentioned it in a previous year also about Rav Kook studying under the Chafetz Chaim and his Kollel for Kohanim. My question is, where do we know this from? Because when you look at it, cursory look at him, there's no mention of him. And if you look at, Google him, or even Google that specifically, nothing comes up. Where do we have this information from that he studied with the Chafetz Chaim? And Chafetz Chaim was the one who encouraged him to go to Eretz Yisrael.
Don't hold me to it, but if I'm telling you off the top of my mind, 2 places you can look that I remember seeing this about it. And by the way, John, I'm going to say a flip side. If you want to know about the relationship of Rav Kook and the Chafetz Chaim, everyone who's familiar with the history of Agudat Israel and the founding of the Agudah, they know that Chafetz Chaim, he wasn't there. He came for the first day, and then he left. And if you read history books, they'll tell you it's because he was sick, or something like that. He wasn't feeling well. He didn't come back to this grand convention of rabbis of Eastern Europe. In fact, if you read the Pashkavilim, what is a Pashkavil? What's a Pashkavil?
It's like a herem.
Yeah, but it's something. It's not just a cherem. A Pashkavil is a specific way to publish something.
Isn't the stuff they glue on the side of buildings?
Yeah, very good. If you've ever been to Yerushalayim and you see, especially in certain neighborhoods, that the walls are covered with these big white posters that say all kinds of words on them. Somebody once told Mori HaRav Yaakov Peretz that when he walks in the streets of Rehov Yafo in Jerusalem, he has to take off his glasses because he doesn't want to see all the nuts, anua things he sees over there. And Rav Peretz said, I don't know what you're talking about. When I walk home to my neighborhood at night through Mea Sha'arim, I take off my glasses, so I don't read all the Lashon Hara that's written on the walls over there. Everyone's writing bad things about everybody else. But somebody once told me that they don't take down those posters because if they did, it's the only thing holding up the buildings. The buildings would all fall down. So these Pashkavilim, Pashkavil, actually the etymology of that word seems to come from a Turkish word. There's all kinds of theories how the word came into Yiddish. But Pashkavil are those big posters. Usually it's the way that the street that is not connected to the internet or not connected to whatever other way to get their news, they get them from these posters. The Pashkavilim from the generation of the Chafetz Chaim tell a very different story. And you can find copies of these Pashkavilim in the biography of HaRav Kook written by Simcha Raz. You know the Simcha Raz? It's called An Angel Among Men. That's the name of the book. It's written in Hebrew originally, but there's an English version, and it was out of print for many years. It's now back in print. I think it's maybe $30 or $40 for that book. In there, he has copies of the Pashkavilim, in which they speak about how the delegates of the Agudah from Israel came to the first kenes of the Agudat Yisrael, and they got up and they started speaking all kinds of things about HaRav Kook. There's a man in Israel, and he's with the Zionists, and and HaRav Kook got up and he left. And when they came to his door to try to get him to come back, these rabbis came to apologize. But what? The Chafetz Chaim left. Yeah, thank you. The Chafetz Chaim left the convention. Chafetz Chaim, when they went to his hotel to try to bring him back, he wouldn't open the door for them. And according to the documents that we have from then, he screamed at them through the door. He doesn't want to talk to them. Anybody who speaks about HaRav Kook, Sofan shel elu lehishtamed. He said, I'm sure that these people ultimately, they will leave Judaism entirely. And I think that it wasn't a prophecy, it was just a proper prediction of exactly how that happened. The second article is, I think there's an article written by Rabbi Shlomo Aviner. I think that's the article that I was telling you about before. 10 stories that yeshiva students should know about HaRav Kook. You should find it there. Those two books will talk to you about the relationship between the Chafetz Chaim and HaRav Kook. There's a third book that I never read, but I'm assuming you can find more information in there. It's in Hebrew. It's written Ben Shnei Kohanim Agedolim, between the two great Kohanim, and it's about the life of the Chafetz Chaim and the life of Rabbi Kook together in one volume. And I think that you could find more information in that book if you wanted to.
One of my rebbeim was Rav Vitali Zaks. Rav Bnei Brak was his great grandson, and he spoke about this. All he would say was that there was something that Chafetz Chaim did not agree with and left. That's all he would.
So the something he didn't agree with, at least according to those who were there, is the way that they spoke about HaRav Kook.
I mean, I know that Rav Vitali, he himself is like his great grandfather. I mean, his Shmur's Lashon is impeccable. It's like, that was his way of saying that.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Okay, Chevron, let's look together here. It says page 11 on the top. I believe that in this introduction that we're about to read, you are going to find many of the ideas that Rabbi Haim David Halevy expanded on already in his introduction. You're going to find the early beginnings of them here in the Beit HaMikdash of HaRav Uziel. Give me one moment. I want to see if I can pull up a picture here. I'll try to send it out a little bit later. If you see the picture of the way that HaRav Uziel learned with his students, I think you will see the humility of a man who was as great as he was and yet as down to earth as he was. I'll find the picture and I'll send it to you. Quotes from the Navi Yeshaya, chapter 1, Pasuk 26. Notice that both Rabbi Haim David Halevy and HaRav Uziel both start their book on national law exactly the same chapter and even with the same verse. Vashiva Shoftaich kevarishona, says the Prophet. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will return your judges as they originally were. V'yoatzaich kevatechila, and your advisors as they were in the beginning. Acharei ken, and after that happens, Yikra lachir hatzedek kirya ne'emana, you will be called the city of righteousness, the town of loyalty, of faithfulness. In order to be called again kirya ne'emana, ir hatzedek, to be the city of Tzedek, you have to first have inside of it Mishpat Tzedek. You have to first have judgment that is honest. To have judgment that is righteous, you have to have judges who are righteous. I know that I introduced this concept already in the first class or second class of our Shiurim. And that is that you cannot divorce the personality of the judge from the law. The lawmaker and the law are so intertwined that you cannot expect, who cares if the lawmaker is a bad person, but what they're saying is good. It can't be that way. You find in the laws of Talmud Torah, Chachamim tell us that it's forbidden to study Torah from a person who has bad character traits, who's a bad person. What does the Chachamim say? Im en harav domeh lemalach Elohim tzevaot. If the rabbi is not comparable to an angel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't ask to study Torah from them. You cannot take away this idea that exists in the West, particularly, and today in Judaism all over the place, that the personality of a person doesn't affect the things they say, the things that they study. When I read Sheilot Utshuvot, books of Chachamim, I can tell so much about the one writing the book from what they say in the book. So much of the way that they obsess over certain details, the way they're not compassionate towards the person asking, or the way they are, the way they care about the person who's asking. You can know so much about a person. Because it's not some dry science, it's not some wisdom that we just read and study and execute. It's something that requires dat, and that dat requires a person to have a certain personality. HaMishpat VeHaShofet. The law and the lawmaker, I'm going to translate it that way. Hem shnei nosim achuzim ukshurim ish berehu. There are two topics that are bound up one with the other. Bekesher bilti nifrad. With a never-ending and a never able to be separated way. Torat HaMishpat bichlala, the whole Torah, the whole realm of justice, yotzeret et nefesh HaShofet, is what creates the soul of the judge. Regesh HaTzedek v'kinat ha'emet shelo, the feelings of righteousness, the zealousness towards truth. No, zealotry is not always a good character trait in the Torah. But here it's a zealot for what? For the truth. והשופט הספוג ברוחו ונשמתו מתורת משפט זו. And the lawmaker who is absorbed in his spirit and his soul from the Torah of justice, מקדשו, sanctifies it, ומרחיבו and broadens it, ומפתחו and expands it, ונותן לו מהלכים בין החיים, Noten lo mehalchim. You familiar with that word from Tanakh?
אולי זה מהלכים?
Mahalachim, am I saying it wrong? If we look up...
כי מהלכים זה פועל.
You're right, Mahalachim, thank you. I'm opening my Tanakh. The book of Zechariah, chapter 3. That's where you're looking. I'm trying to find my Tanakh is far over there. Zechariah, chapter 3. If you get to it before me. Here. Zechariah, chapter 3, pasuk 7. כה אמר אדוני צבאות, אם בדרכי תלך, ואם את משמרתי תשמור, וגם אתה תדין את ביתי, וגם תשמור את חצריי. ונתתי לך מלכים. פתח under the mem. בין העומדים האלה. I will permit you to move about among these attendants, says the Navi. This is a word that means freedom of movement, is really the most correct. He gives justice the ability to move everywhere, beyond the Beradin, beyond the courts, beyond law. החיים הכלכליים, הציבוריים, financial, public life, החברותיים והמדיניים, the social life, the political life, ובהתאחדותם הגמורה של שני נושאים אלה קשורה הצלחת העם. And if we can unite these two ideas together, the success of a nation is dependent on that. Shalom hamdina, the peace of a country, והתפתחותה המסחרי והתעשייתי בכל היקפם, and the development of its commercial and industrial side in all of its ways. Torat HaMishpat, the Torah of Mishpat, of justice, כשהיא מבוססת על יסודות של אמת וצדק, when they are based on values of truth and righteousness, שוויון אזרחי, when there's a value of equality among citizens of a country. That's a very special thing that HaRav Uziel is talking about, equality between citizens of a country. Let me see, where did I put that book? Here. If I can quickly find a page for you, I will. When HaRav Uziel became the chief Sephardic rabbi, one of the first things he did is make sure that the non-Jews in Eretz Israel were taken care of. I'm reading to you from the book of Rabbi Angel. During attacks on Jews in 1921, one group of Arabs engaged in a shooting battle with Jewish defenders. Rabbi Uziel, learning of this battle, now this is in the context of the 1917 Balfour Declaration and all of the tension that comes after that. Rabbi Uziel, learning of the battle, dressed in his rabbinical garb and went to the area of combat. So they're shooting at each other, and Rabbi Uziel gets all dressed up like it's Shabbat, and he walks out into the middle of the battlefield. He asked the Jews to hold their fire. He then walked in front of the Jewish line of defense and headed towards the Arab line. He called on them to also to hold their fire. And they did. I can imagine even from the sheer shock of who is this crazy rabbi in the middle of the battlefield. Rabbi Uziel, standing alone in the field between the two camps, turned to the Arabs and spoke to them in Arabic. I know that what I might say is not understood by some, but you think it would make sense in the Middle East, as a country in the Middle East, that at least some of the people leading this country for the last 75 years should be fluent Arabic speakers? You would think. Just a thought. He speaks to the Arabs in Arabic, and he reminded them that the land of Israel had been under many rulers over the centuries, ever since the Jews had been exiled by the Romans in antiquity, and that now the Jews intended to reestablish Jewish rule in their ancient homeland. The land had been desolate and disease-infested, but the Jews had come and improved conditions dramatically, benefiting all the inhabitants of the land. This remarkable development was a sign of God's providence, of His hand in the destiny of this land. So Uziel, in the middle of war, is giving a drasha, like a Shabbat morning drasha, to the Arabs in Arabic. The land of Israel had vast blessings, some of which had already been brought to light, and most of which would appear in the future, bringing happiness and prosperity to all residents of this amazing land. Rabbi Uziel urged the Arabs to make peace with the Jews, so that all could work together in love and respect. You're talking about 1921. This is long before there was a state of Israel. After these comments, he moved closer to the Arab antagonists and called out to them with great emotion. I didn't write these words, I'm reading to you. Now, the words that I'm reading, I'm done reading Rabbi Angel, I'm reading to you directly from HaRav Uziel. So this is HaRav Uziel translated into English. Our cousins, says HaRav Uziel, our mutual ancestor, Avraham, father of Yitzchak and Ishmael, when he saw that his nephew Lot felt constricted and complained that they could no longer live together, he said to him, let there be no feud between me and you, nor between my shepherds and your shepherds, for we are brothers. So too do we say to you, the land will carry us all, will sustain us all. Let us stop the feuds between us. We are brothers. The Arabs were moved by the rabbi's words and by his courage. They put their guns away, and the battle came to an end, at least for the moment. It wasn't the end of Rabbi Uziel's attempts to bring peace. While Rabbi Uziel was busy bringing peace, he didn't stop by saying, we're here, we're not going anywhere, this land is ours, we will take it. But just because we will does not mean that we want anything bad here to happen. In 1939, when Rabbi Uziel became the Rishon LeZion officially, he delivered an address on the radio which was broadcasted throughout Israel. And he said, and I'm quoting to you from his book, Michmenei Uziel, on page 424. Our first task is the establishment of true peace and strong unity among all segments of the people, its communities and ethnic groups, its organizations and parties, to call, quote, peace, peace to those who are far and near, among ourselves, and peace with all our neighbors in the land of all religions and peoples. And then he reaches out to the Arab citizens on the radio. And he says, we reach our hands out to you in peace, pure and trustworthy. We say, the land is stretched out before us, and with joined hands we will work it, we will uncover its treasures, and we will live on it as brothers who dwell together. Know and trust that the word of our God will rise forever. Make peace with us, and we will make peace with you. Together, all of us will benefit from the blessing of God in His land, with quiet and peace, with love and fellowship, with goodwill and pure heart. We will find the way of peace. It hurt HaRav Uziel to no end to recognize that Jewish leadership cared as little for peace as did Arab leadership. And he struggled over the years to try to convince at least the Jewish side of the argument to want peace as much as he did. In a letter to Jewish people who were against peace, he wrote, "The Torah of Israel, all of whose paths are peace, calls for peace and love for its people and all who are created in the image of Hashem." And I think that some people will look at Rav Uziel, what a naive man. Maybe he didn't know anything about the Middle East. Maybe he didn't understand what was happening in Eretz Yisrael. You could say a lot of things about Rav Uziel. Sometimes I wonder what a world would look like with leadership like Rav Uziel's. When he says here this word, Shivyon Ezrachi, equality among all citizens of a country, Rav Uziel was not just speaking to Jewish people. In fact, a theme in this entire book that he's writing, HaShofet VeHaMishpat, is how do we bring back a halachic state of Israel? He wants, don't think that Rav Uziel is hiding, he wants a Jewish state of Israel. How does he allow for a Jewish state of Israel to also incorporate into its legal system non-Jews, particularly Muslims, Arabs who live in Eretz Yisrael? Representation in courts, representation in law, in Knesset, as witnesses in a Bedin. Those are central themes that he discusses here. Doesn't give up on a vision. We might argue it's too idealistic. That's for you to argue. Rav Uziel believed that anything could happen. חופש גמור של פעולות ומעשים והכרת זכות הקניין וערך העבודה ועובדיה. Freedom of action, of movement, of זכות הקניין. In English, they translate as property rights. And there's an essential right that we believe people have a right to their property. Rav Uziel is fighting not just movements outside of the Jewish people, but inside of the Jewish people who were pushing for forms of government in which individual rights were not a thing at all. I'm dancing around using overt terms, but Rav Uziel believed very much that the only way to build a proper country was to build it on a foundation of rights that people have. But more than that, Rav Uziel has a letter elsewhere in which he says, how do you expect Jewish people to come from countries that are civilized, countries that are good for them? See, you can bring all the immigrants that were thrown out of their country to Israel. They have no choice. Where are they going to go? But how do you attract a Jew? I'm going to translate into the words of today. How are you going to attract a Jew from America to come to Israel if in order to live in Israel, they'll have to take a step or 2 steps or 10 steps back in their personal freedoms, in a capitalistic economy, you fill in the blanks. You have to make Eretz Yisrael attractive and worthwhile for all Jews in the world to want to come back, not just for those who have no choice. To value the worker and the work, hu amud hatavech shekol shalom ha'am v'kiyumo, that all the peace of the world and of the nation and its existence, hafrachato v'atzlachato tolui bo, that it's all dependent on these things. Ulam Torazo, but this Torah of justice, kashehi la'atzma, when it's on its own, when you just study it in the Beit Midrash, en hashpa'ata nikeret b'chaim terem hitlabsha b'ishiyuto shel HaShofet. You don't really appreciate the values of Jewish justice, of Mishpat Tzedek, until you meet a Shofet, a judge who is a tzaddik, until that clothing is embellished on a person who lives by these laws. Shehi hatmuna hachaya v'abihira hamuchashit v'niglet le'enenu. This person now becomes the vivid image that is in front of us, the tangible example of what this Torah would look like if people were actually to live by it. V'ishiyut hapoelet lehashlim teudat hamishpat v'tafkido, that this shofet will take on their shoulders the job of bringing about the ultimate goals of Jewish justice. ולהגיע על תכלית מטרתו, תורת ישראל, במשפטיה הישרים והצדיקים. יצרה לנו דור שופטים נאמנים לרווחה ולתעודתה. That you could find, finally, in the Jewish people, judges who live by Jewish law, who show an example of how beautiful the world could be if people live by this. I want to say the flip side of this. I know what time it is, so my show is going to end in a couple minutes. The flip side is, if a judge who is righteous, if a person embodies Torah Israel and inspires the world to want to be involved in Torah Israel, tell me about the damage that is caused by people who claim to embody the Torah of the Jewish people and end up being fanatic and violent and dangerous and rude and crude and hurtful and insensitive. What does that do to people wanting to affiliate themselves with Torah Israel? They say, don't confuse Judaism with the Jews. I hear this all the time. It's just a stupid thing. What do you mean? If these are the Jews that this Judaism gave birth to, do I really want a part of it? You're not selling me a theoretical idea. I want to see how it looks in action. We need, in order to convince anybody that Mishpat Tzedek, that the righteousness of the Torah can build a better society, show me that the people who would create are any better than the other crooks and criminals that I see now. I'd rather the crooks that I know than the crooks I don't know. That's what I would like. Let me finish this paragraph. Shoftim ele, these judges. Yitzurei Torah HaMishpat, creations of the Torah of justice of the Jewish people. Biratam hakodemet lechochmatam, whose fear. Do you remember where this Mishnah in Avot says? Kol shirat cheto kodemet lechochmato. Chochmato mitkayemet. Says the Mishnah that a person who has fear of heaven, fear of sin, you can argue what the difference is between those two things. Before they have wisdom, they're a good person. Before they have wisdom, then their wisdom is also worth something. What does it help to have wisdom with a person who is an ugly person, who's a vile person? It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't make anything good. Uvekinatam haboeret mishpat tzedek v'din emet, and their zealousness, zeal, for proper tzedek, for righteousness, for truth, hotziu leor mishpat emet, they brought to light true judgment. Mitoch arpilei hasheker v'tarmit hameikim oto. They uncovered from all of the lies and the deceit and the corruption that exists in the world that try to cover up truth and good and beauty. These shoftim, because they cared about truth and righteousness and good, they always were able to bring out, to extract the good from everything. Bain choderet uvochenet hikiru hadin hamerumeh v'yidrechaku mimenu. They stayed away from all things that were false and conniving and trickery, and they stayed away from them. Uvidinam din emet lamito hishru shalom ve'ava ben kol sderot ha'am u'ma'amadav. And with their ideals of truth, of tzedek, they were able to bring peace between all the different social, political, religious levels of all the communities they were ever part of. The next section that we're going to read together next week, HaRav Uziel says the reason why our Chachamim were consulted for 2,000 years, the reason why the Jewish people brought their most sensitive national issues, political issues, religious issues, family, marital issues, all the issues they had, the reason they brought them to the Shoftim was because they trusted them, that they always successfully brought about a solution which was good for the people. You know, there's an article, I don't remember where I read it, an academic article, which shows you the novels that came out of North Africa, Jewish North Africa. The novels that, different romances and other books, not necessarily religious novels. And you see at which point the rabbi was always this wise man that everyone came to and asked advice from, and always had a clever solution, even for the most outlandish scenarios, was always able to bring peace. And it's at a certain point in Jewish history that the rabbi goes from being the chacham, the person that everyone goes to consult with, to being the fool of the town, like the idiot who doesn't have any good advice for anybody, who's always messing things up, who's always giving people wrong religious advice in situations that don't call for it. And this author, who's an academic, shows that this is really represents it's not an evolution, it's the opposite of the rabbinic model in the eyes of people. We went to our Chachamim, all of those books of Shailot u'Tshuvot that people asked Chachamim, because they trusted their advice. They saw in them people who brought about good things. It wasn't just the Jewish people. HaRav Matzliach Mazuz. Have you heard of Matzliach Mazuz? HaRav Matzliach Mazuz was the father of Rabbi Meir Mazuz of Bnei Brak. He was a rabbi in Jerba. He was the chief rabbi of the Bet Adin in Jerba, in Tunis. And he, by day, was the chief justice of the Jewish court there. And by night, he was the chief justice of the Muslim court, the Sharia law court in Jerba. In the daytime, he would rule according to Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, and at nighttime, according to Muslim law. Now, you can argue how that works. It's not for me. I'm telling you now a story. Why did they choose him? Why would he be the justice of the Muslims in Jerba? They didn't have their own justices. Because they trusted him. They trusted his tzidkut, his personality, his righteousness, his eye for justice, for truth, for peace. They trusted him to render judgment. Why did he do it at night? Because in the nighttime, the Batei Din don't operate. We don't, in Danim Balayna, we don't have judgment at night. So at night, he gave his time to the Muslim community of Jerba. He ended up, unfortunately, being murdered by one of the people who he ruled against in his court. And that's why you'll see that they always write after his name, that he was murdered. But this idea that these people were people that used to represent something that we wanted, of value. HaRav Uziel here is criticizing a generation of rabbis that has made people not want to be Jewish. Is if you want people to want the Torah, you want people to want Mishpat Tzedek, righteous laws, on a national level, you have to convince the nation, by virtue of your actions, that this is something that will make their life better and not worse. This job is a very tall order, what we're asking for. HaRav Uziel is going to explain to us in the coming weeks exactly what that looks like and what does that mean. But for today, I wanted to introduce you to the personality of HaRav Uziel, to the thoughts of HaRav Uziel. We're going to be jumping back and forth into the writings of HaRav Uziel throughout this shiur, because many ideas that he brought and he taught about are alluded to in the writings of Rabbi Haim David Halevy, even if not overtly. And sometimes I like to show you how they look in the source. Bezrat Hashem will continue here next week. For right now, I wanted to thank you for learning Torah with me. And when I pray every day, soon we'll be praying Arvit. For me, it's not yet Lag BaOmer. HaShofet VeHaMishpat. Return our judges, our leaders, like they used to be. All of the people who get disenchanted at Jewish leadership today, and they have all kinds of things to say. And I always say, look, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we used to have righteous judges. It's something we can bring back. It's something that is on our shoulders. You can be that person. You can be when you say HaShofet VeHaMishpat, maybe you're talking about yourself. Maybe instead of blaming everyone else in the world, maybe you can step up to the plate and embody, and I know many of you, and I know that many of you already do, but can embody a Judaism, a Torah, that's Mishpat Tzedek, that is righteous, that will show the world, not just the Jewish world, but all across the world, that we have Mishpat Tzedek. Ki am chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh. The nations of the world will say, wow, look at this nation. Look at all the wonder, the wisdom, the beauty this nation brings to the world. We can do it. It's not far away from us. It's something that we can do. And Bezrat Hashem, I pray that together, by learning these halachot, we'll be able to bring about such a revolution together. God willing.